The Poisoned Chessboard. Chapter 1. It was a singularly grim and bitter night when the summons arrived. A coded telegram addressed to Sherlock Holmes at Turkish 21B Baker Street. The gaslights flickered feebly against the heavy London fog, and outside, the world seemed to shrink into a dense, suffocating gloom. I had just settled into my chair, ready to enjoy a quiet evening with the latest medical journal, when Holmes, with a sharp intake of breath, lowered the telegram and fixed me with an intense gaze. "Come, Watson," he said briskly, rising from his seat. "There is a case of extraordinary perplexity awaiting us. Inspector Lestrade is at St. Bartholomew's. A man has been found dead at his chessboard, poisoned, yet with no trace of the fatal agent." I stared at him. Poisoned at his chessboard? But surely, Holmes, poisoning is not an unheard-of method of murder. Holmes's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. "Ah, but this is not merely a case of poisoning. The victim, one Sir Reginald Havisham, was discovered in the locked confines of his private study. The door was bolted from the inside, and the windows secured. No food or drink was touched. The only thing before him was a chessboard in mid-play. And yet he is dead, beyond all medical aid. Tell me, Watson, how does a man die of poisoning when there is no means by which he could have been poisoned?" But out, breath caught. A locked-room mystery. Indeed, Holmes was already donning his overcoat. "The game is afoot, Watson. We must not keep Lestrade waiting." St. Bartholomew's Hospital lay in eerie silence, the usual cacophony of the city muffled by the thick veil of mist. The corridors reeked of disinfectant and damp stone. Lestrade met us at the entrance, his usually confident demeanour somewhat unsettled. "I tell you, Holmes, it makes no sense," he muttered as we strode towards the examination room. "No puncture, wounds, no traces of poison in his glass. The doctors are baffled, and yet the man is dead, plain as day. Rigor mortis has already set in." Holmes offered no response. His keen eyes took in every detail. The scuff marks on the floor, the way Lestrade's fingers twitched restlessly, the faint scent of ink and varnish in the air. We entered the chamber where the body lay. Sir Reginald Havisham, a distinguished man in his 60s, was slumped over the chessboard, his fingers still gripping a knight-piece. His face was frozen in an expression of mild surprise. There were no outward signs of violence, no struggle, no indication of pain. It was as if death had come upon him in the middle of a thought. Holmes moved closer, his fingers ghosting over the chessboard. The game was in progress, a Sicilian defence, if I am not mistaken. White had the advantage. Curious. Lestrade blinked. "You think the game itself is relevant?" "Everything is relevant until proven otherwise." Holmes's gaze sharpened as he examined Sir Reginald's hands. "Look here, Watson. Do you notice anything unusual?" I leaned in. His fingertips are slightly reddened. A reaction, perhaps? Holmes nodded approvingly. An astute observation. A subtle sign, but one that tells a story nonetheless. Now, let us consider the impossibility of our predicament. A man poisoned without ingesting poison. A room locked from the inside. A game unfinished. And a singular detail. He held up the chess piece clutched in the dead man's hand. "Why, would a dying man hold on to this so tightly?" Lestrade scoffed. Perhaps he was making his last move when the poison took effect. Holmes's lips twitched. Perhaps. Or perhaps he was trying to tell us something. The study at Sir Reginald's estate was precisely as described. Locked from the inside, the windows bolted, and not a sign of forced entry. The air was heavy with the scent of parchment and dust, the flickering gas lamp casting shifting shadows over the grand mahogany desk. Holmes paced, his fingers steepled in thought. "Lestrade, describe to me the state of the body when it was found. Every detail." Lestrade exhaled. "He was seated just like this." He gestured to the empty chair before the chessboard. His head had slumped forward slightly. No signs of distress. His hands were resting on the table, one of them holding that chess piece you saw. Holmes tilted his head. "No signs of distress, you say? And yet he was gripping the chess piece. Hardly the action of a man meeting a peaceful end." "What are you suggesting, Holmes?" I asked. Holmes tapped a finger against his chin. "I am suggesting, Watson, that whatever happened in this room, it was not as quiet as it appears. This was not a painless death. Something startled him, and we shall discover what." He leaned in, his sharp gaze fixed on the chessboard. His fingers ghosted over the polished wooden pieces, lingering for a fraction of a second on the knight Sir Reginald had clutched in death. Then, to my surprise, he drew back and dusted off his hands. "Gentlemen, I have seen enough. There is more to this case than meets the eye. We must return to Baker Street." Lestrade gaped. "But you've hardly examined the room." Holmes smiled faintly. "On the contrary, Lestrade, I have examined all I need to, and I believe we have just witnessed a murder without a murderer. Now, all that remains is to find the impossible truth." With that, he strode toward the door, leaving me and Lestrade to exchange bewildered glances before hurrying after him into the London fog. Hish! Chapter 2. The cab ride back to Baker Street was marked by an unusual silence. Holmes, wrapped in his Inverness cape, sat with his eyes half closed, his fingertips pressed together in contemplation. I knew better than to disturb him when he was in such a state, for his mind was doubtless engaged in a rapid procession of deductions that no spoken word of mine could hasten. Yet, as we neared our lodgings, he suddenly stirred, his eyes gleaming in the dim glow of the gas lamps outside. "Watson, tell me, what did you make of Sir Reginald's grip on the chess piece?" I considered for a moment. It seemed unnatural. A dying man, even in his final moments, would not waste his strength clutching a wooden knight unless it meant something. Holmes nodded approvingly. "Precisely. And yet, the question remains, what was he trying to tell us?" Before I could venture a response, the cab halted, and we stepped out into the familiar embrace of Baker Street. The night air was crisp, carrying the distant clatter of carriage wheels and the occasional whistle of a watchman. As we ascended the stairs to our rooms, Mrs. Hudson met us at the threshold, her usual composure tinged with concern. "There's a gentleman waiting for you, Mr. Holmes," she said in a hushed tone. "He arrived not half an hour ago, seemed in quite a state." Holmes's eyes flickered with interest. "Did he give a name?" Mrs. Hudson shook her head. "No, sir, but he insisted it was a matter of life and death." Holmes cast me a glance, his lips curving ever so slightly. Life and death, Watson. That sounds promising. We entered the sitting room to find a man pacing near the fireplace, his back to us. He was of middle years, his frame tall but slightly hunched, as if burdened by some unseen weight. His gloved hands were clasped tightly before him, and the moment we stepped in, he spun around, revealing a face pale with agitation. "You are Sherlock Holmes?" he asked breathlessly. Holmes inclined his head. "I am. And you, sir, appear to be a man pursued by shadows." The man swallowed hard and removed his gloves, revealing fingers that trembled slightly. "My name is James Winthrop. I was Sir Reginald's personal secretary, and I believe I am next." I stiffened. "Next? You mean—" "That whoever killed Sir Reginald will come for me," Winthrop said grimly, "and soon." Holmes regarded him with the calm intensity of a predator sizing up its prey. "You are afraid," he said softly, "not just for your life, but for something more." Winthrop exhaled sharply. "You are correct, Mr. Holmes. I am afraid, because I know why he was murdered." A charged silence followed. I caught my breath, watching as Holmes leaned forward slightly, his interest now fully engaged. "Then you had best tell us everything," he said. Winthrop hesitated, his gaze flickering toward the window, as though expecting some unseen menace to materialize. Then, steeling himself, he began. "Sir Reginald was involved in a game far more dangerous than chess," he said in a low voice. "For the past several months he had been receiving threats, cryptic warnings sent in plain envelopes always, signed with the same phrase, 'The Black King moves next.' Holmes's expression did not change, but I saw the way his fingers tapped lightly against the arm of his chair. 'Curious,' he murmured. 'And yet none of these warnings were reported. To the police?' Winthrop shook his head. 'Sir Reginald dismissed them. He believed it to be the work of an old rival, a petty mind trying to unnerve him. But I was not so sure. There were too many coincidences, too many hushed conversations and unexplained absences. And then, on the night he died, I found this." He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded scrap of paper. Holmes took it delicately, his sharp gaze scanning the contents. I leaned in, my stomach tightening as I read the ominous message. "Checkmate comes at dawn." Holmes tapped the paper thoughtfully. "This was delivered the night of his murder?" Winthrop nodded, slipped under the door of his study. He read it just before he sat down to his final game. For a long moment, Holmes said nothing. The only sound was the faint ticking of the mantel clock, counting down the seconds as some invisible calculation ran through his mind. Then, finally, he rose and crossed to the window, peering into the fog-laden street below. "Tell me, Mr. Winthrop," he said at last, "do you know of anyone who would benefit from Sir Reginald's death?" Winthrop hesitated, his throat bobbing. I believe so. But it is not just about money, Mr. Holmes. This is something deeper, something older." Holmes turned, his eyes gleaming. "Ah, now that is interesting," I frowned. "Holmes, do you mean to say that this murder is not just about revenge, Watson?" Holmes's smile was thin and sharp. "It is about a game. A very old game. One where the pieces move unseen until it is too late." He turned back to Winthrop. You were right to come to me. And now, if you truly wish to live to see another sunrise, I suggest you do exactly as I say, for this game is far from over. Chapter 6. In 3, the morning was bleak, the London fog settling over the city like a thick shroud. Holmes and I had departed Baker Street early, our client, James Winthrop, in tow. As we rode towards Sir Reginald Havisham's estate, the rattling of the carriage wheels served as an ominous metronome, keeping time with the heavy thoughts pressing upon my mind. Holmes sat across from me, his fingers steepled, his gaze distant, but sharp. He had spoken little since Winthrop's confession, but I knew his mind was already dissecting the case piece by piece. "I assume Scotland Yard has sealed off the study?" he finally asked Winthrop. Winthrop, pale but composed, nodded. Inspector Lestrade assured me that nothing has been touched. The staff have been kept away, and the doors remain locked. Holmes gave a slight nod of approval. "Good. Then let us see what the scene itself has to say." We arrived at Havisham Manor, a grand but aged estate resting on the outskirts of London. The building loomed before us, its ivy-clad walls appearing almost skeletal in the morning light. I had expected a household steeped in mourning, but instead an unsettling stillness hung over the property. A uniformed officer led us to the study, where Inspector Lestrade was already waiting. He greeted us with a curt nod, clearly irked by our presence but too professional to protest. "Well, Holmes, you've arrived, and just in time to see that there's no mystery at all." Holmes arched an eyebrow. "Indeed?" Lestrade gestured toward the desk. "We've examined the scene again, and the only rational conclusion is that Havisham ingested the poison himself, perhaps by accident. There were no signs of forced entry, no food or drink laced with poison, and no one else entered the room. It is as clear as day." Holmes stepped past him, his expression unreadable. "As clear as day," he echoed. "Yes, the sort of day that blinds a man when he forgets to open his eyes." Lestrade scoffed, but Holmes had already moved to the desk. His sharp gaze scanned the chessboard, the parchment-strewn desk, and finally the high-backed chair where Sir Reginald had met his demise. He circled the room like a wolf surveying its domain, pausing only once to examine the fireplace. I watched as he reached out and touched the mantelpiece, his fingers lingering on a section of wood. Then, without a word, he turned back to the desk and studied the chess pieces, his fingers ghosting over them with the same delicate precision I had seen him use when examining a crime scene for powder burns or stray fibres. His eyes narrowed as they landed upon the Black King. "Watson," he murmured, "observe this." I stepped closer and followed his gaze. The chessboard was still in the middle of a game, pieces frozen in conflict. The Black King was positioned slightly off-centre, just enough to seem unnatural. "What do you see?" Holmes pressed. I frowned. "It is misplaced, but that could have been a result of the victim's collapse." Holmes gave me a knowing smile. "A reasonable assumption, Watson. And yet, why is there no dust beneath it?" I inhaled sharply. Holmes was right. The rest of the board bore a fine layer of dust, disturbed only by the movements of the game. But the square beneath the Black King was spotless. Lestrade, now watching with interest, folded his arms. "You think someone moved it after the fact?" Holmes tapped the piece lightly, his expression thoughtful. "I think he said slowly, "that Sir Reginald was trying to tell us something, and I intend to listen." With that, he plucked the Black King from the board and turned it over. A faint click sounded. Holmes held the piece up to the light, revealing a hollow compartment at its base. Inside, nestled like a secret waiting to be uncovered, was a tiny rolled-up slip of paper. Lestrade's mouth fell open. "Well, I'll be—" Holmes unrolled the note carefully. The ink was smudged, but the words were still legible. "The Black King moves next. Beware the bishop." A chill ran down my spine. "The bishop?" I echoed. "What does that mean?" Holmes's expression darkened. "It means, Watson, that Sir Reginald knew he was going to die, and he was trying to warn us before it was too late." Winthrop, who had been silent until now, exhaled unsteadily. "The Black King, the same signature from the threats he received." Holmes nodded. "Indeed, but notice the phrasing, 'moves next.'" This was no mere warning. It was a statement of intent. Lestrade furrowed his brow. "You mean to say there's going to be another murder?" Holmes turned the chess piece over in his fingers, lost in thought. "A game does not end until checkmate is declared. The Black King moved against Sir Reginald, and now, it seems, the next piece has already been chosen." His gaze flickered to the note once more. "Beware the bishop." For the first time, Holmes looked truly troubled. I stepped forward. "Holmes, what is it? What does it mean?" Holmes's gaze was distant. "It means, Watson, that our next victim has already been marked." A long silence settled over the room, the weight of the discovery pressing upon us. The game was still being played, and somewhere, in the shadows of London, the next move had already been made. We were running out of time. Chapter 4. Holmes stood motionless, staring at the tiny note that had been concealed within the Black King. The room seemed to shrink around us, the weight of Sir Reginald's final warning pressing down like an unspoken omen. "The Black King moves next. Beware the bishop." The words gnawed at me. I glanced at Holmes, waiting for him to explain the meaning behind them, but he remained silent, his eyes dark with thought. Lestrade, ever the man of action, scoffed. A cryptic message from a dead man. It could mean anything. Holmes finally spoke, his voice measured. "No, Lestrade, it means something very specific, and if we fail to understand it in time, another man will die." Winthrop shifted uneasily. "You believe this refers to a second murder?" "I do," Holmes said simply, "and I intend to prevent it." With that, he turned abruptly and began pacing the length of the study, his sharp eyes scanning the bookshelves, the fireplace, the heavy curtains. He was not merely looking. He was absorbing, cataloguing, fitting unseen pieces together in that brilliant mind of his. I followed his gaze, trying to see what he saw. "Holmes," I said carefully, "why would Sir Reginald reference a bishop?" Holmes stopped. He turned to me, his expression unreadable. "That, my dear Watson, is the question that will decide whether we are too late." The ride back to Baker Street was fraught with tension. Holmes sat rigid, his fingers drumming against the carriage door. I knew this sign. It meant his mind was racing at a ferocious speed, following threads that had yet to fully unravel. Finally, unable to endure, the silence any longer, I spoke. "Holmes, you clearly noticed something back at the estate, something you have not yet shared." He gave me a sidelong glance, his lips twitching in the faintest of smiles. "Watson, you are learning." "Then tell me." He exhaled, leaning back against the seat. "There are 3 key facts that we must now contend with. First, Sir Reginald was aware of his impending murder. His note makes that evident. Second, the message was hidden within a chess piece, indicating that he either suspected his killer or had deduced their plan before they struck. And third, he trailed off, his gaze flickering towards the fog-laced city beyond the carriage window. Third is the matter of the bishop." I frowned. "You believe the bishop is a person?" Holmes gave a slight nod. "It would seem the most logical conclusion. But not just any person, Watson. Someone integral to this game. Someone who has remained unseen, yet pivotal in the unfolding scheme." I turned his words over in my mind, my thoughts circling the question that haunted us both. Who was the bishop? As if in answer, Holmes suddenly rapped his knuckles against the carriage wall. "Driver, change course. Take us to St. John's Cathedral." I started. "A cathedral? Holmes, what? I have a suspicion," he said, his voice now edged with urgency. "And if I am correct, then the next move in this deadly game is already in play." St. John's Cathedral stood in solemn silence, its spires stretching skyward like accusing fingers. The great wooden doors loomed before us, their iron hinges rusted with age. Holmes wasted no time in pushing them open, and we stepped into the vast, dimly lit nave. The air inside was thick with the scent of wax and aged stone. A few scattered candles flickered against the gloom, casting long, wavering shadows along the walls. The hush was oppressive, the stillness almost unnatural. A lone figure stood near the altar, clad in the dark robes of the clergy. His back was to us, but as we approached he turned, a gaunt man with piercing grey eyes and a sharp, angular face. Holmes studied him for a long moment before speaking. "Reverend Sinclair, I presume." The man inclined his head. "I am he, and you are Sherlock Holmes." I stiffened. There was no surprise in his voice, only certainty. Holmes did not acknowledge the remark. Instead, he held up the slip of paper. "Sir Reginald Havisham left us a warning. I believe you may be able to tell us what it means." For a fleeting second, I thought I saw something flicker across the Reverend's face, something too swift to name. But then it was gone, replaced by an expression of practiced neutrality. "I fear I do not know, Mr. Holmes." Holmes took a slow step forward. "No?" Sinclair met his gaze steadily. "Sir Reginald was known to be a man of many eccentricities. If he left you a cryptic message, I would not presume to understand its meaning." Holmes tilted his head slightly, his eyes gleaming in the candlelight. "And yet you were one of the last people to see him alive." A pause. The Reverend's fingers tightened ever so slightly around the brass candle holder beside him. "Ashishim was his confessor," he admitted. "He came to me 3 nights ago, troubled in spirit. He spoke of mistakes, past sins that had come back to haunt him. He feared he had set something into motion that he could not stop." Holmes's expression did not change, but I saw the subtle sharpening of his gaze. Did he mention a name? Sinclair hesitated. No, I exhaled in frustration. Then why the warning? Why single out the bishop? Holmes turned the slip of paper over in his hand, his eyes tracing the words one last time, before he tucked it into his coat. Because, he murmured, the bishop was never meant to be a clue. I frowned. What do you mean? Holmes turned his back on the Reverend, already striding toward the exit. I mean, Watson, that Sir Reginald was telling us where to look. Not for a man, but for the truth. The moment we stepped outside, Holmes quickened his pace, his movements precise and deliberate. I had seen him like this before, when a case had reached the razor's edge of revelation. "What is it, Holmes?" I demanded. He halted abruptly, turning to me with a look that sent a shiver through my bones. "Watson, listen carefully. We are being outplayed." My breath caught. "By whom?" Holmes's gaze drifted back toward the cathedral. His expression was unreadable, but his voice was laced with something I rarely heard from him: unease. "That," he said quietly, "is what I intend to find out." And with that, he strode into the fog, leaving me scrambling to keep up. The game was not over. It was only beginning. Chapter 5. We walked in silence, the fog curling around us like a living thing, as we left St. John's Cathedral behind. Estate moved swiftly, his long strides cutting through the mist with purpose. Though he had yet to explain his thoughts in full, I could sense that something had shifted within him. Some unseen connection had been made, though I could not yet grasp its shape. At last I could bear it no longer. "Holmes," I said, quickening my pace to match his, "what did you mean when you said Sir Reginald was telling us where to look?" Holmes did not stop walking. "Watson, do you recall the way the note was written?" I frowned, trying to recall its exact phrasing. It said, "The Black King moves next. Beware the bishop." Holmes nodded. "Yes, and consider what we now know. Sir Reginald had foreseen his own murder. He concealed that message inside the Black King, knowing it would eventually be found. But tell me, Watson, why would a man use his dying moments to leave a warning? About a bishop?" I hesitated. "You believe it was not a reference to Reverend Sinclair?" Holmes gave a rare smile, thin and sharp. "No, my dear Watson, that would have been far too obvious. Sir Reginald was an intelligent man, and his choice of words was deliberate. If he had wished to warn us of a specific person, he would have named them outright." I pondered this for a moment before realization dawned. "Then you believe he was referring to a title, a rank rather than a man?" Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Precisely. The bishop is not a man, it is a position. And that, Watson, changes everything." We returned to Baker Street, where Holmes immediately flung off his coat and reached for the stack of newspapers piled near the window. He rifled through them with feverish energy, his keen eyes scanning the columns as though searching for some hidden pattern. I sat in my chair, watching him with a growing sense of unease. There was a charge in the air, an unspoken tension that prickled at the edges of my thoughts. "Holmes, what are you looking for?" "Connections, Watson," he murmured, barely glancing up. "Patterns. A thread that binds this affair together." Minutes passed in silence. Then, quite suddenly, Holmes let out a soft exclamation of triumph and tapped a finger against a headline. I leaned forward, my eyes narrowing as I read aloud. Mysterious fire destroys archive at St. Augustine's Library. Rare documents lost. Looked at Holmes in confusion. A fire? What does this have to do with Sir Reginald's murder? Holmes sat back, steepling his fingers. St. Augustine's Library housed some of the oldest records in London, including documents pertaining to secret societies, buried scandals, and hidden histories. He tapped the newspaper again. The fire occurred 3 nights ago, Watson. The same night Sir Reginald visited Reverend Sinclair. Now tell me, do you still believe in coincidence? I exhaled sharply. You think Sir Reginald discovered something at that library? Something that cost him his life? Holmes nodded, and I suspect he was not alone in that discovery. A silence settled between us, the weight of the revelation pressing down like a storm cloud. At last I found my voice. Holmes, what is this case truly about? For a moment he said nothing. Then at last he spoke. Power, Watson. Influence. A game played in the shadows, where kings and bishops are not merely pieces on a board, but real men. Men who have shaped the course of history from behind locked doors. I felt a chill run through me. A secret society? Holmes inclined his head. That would be my wager. And if we do not act quickly, we may soon find that the Black King has already made his next move. The evening deepened as we pored over every scrap of information we could find, but no clear answers emerged. The name, St. Augustine's Library, sent Holmes into a focused silence, his sharp mind running through possibilities I could scarcely fathom. At last, near midnight, he stood abruptly. Come, Watson, we must pay a visit to a man who may have the answers we seek. I blinked, rising from my chair. At this hour? And who, may I ask, are we calling upon? Holmes smiled faintly. A man who deals in knowledge others would rather keep hidden. The address Holmes provided led us to a dimly lit alley near Fleet Street, where the flickering glow of a single lantern illuminated a heavy oak door. Holmes rapped upon it twice, and after a moment a slot in the wood slid open. A pair of wary eyes studied us. Who sent you? Holmes leaned in slightly. The Black King moves next. The door creaked open immediately, and we stepped inside. The room beyond was small and cluttered, lined with bookshelves that sagged under the weight of old tomes and scattered papers. A thin man with ink-stained fingers and a shrewd expression gestured for us to sit. "I assume you are Sherlock Holmes," he said, his voice a whisper of amusement. Holmes inclined his head. "And you are Elias Crowley, former archivist of St. Augustine's." Crowley smirked. "I suppose I shouldn't be surprised you know that." Holmes wasted no time. "Tell me, Mr. Crowley, what was destroyed in the fire?" Crowley's expression darkened. "Many things, Mr. Holmes, but there was one particular set of documents that was of considerable interest." Holmes leaned forward. "Go on." Crowley hesitated. Then, after a glance toward the door, he whispered, "The records of the Order of the Black King." My breath caught. Holmes's eyes flashed. "Tell me everything," he said. Crowley exhaled. "It was an old society, one of influence, manipulation, and control. Kings and statesmen, bankers and judges, men who shape the world without ever stepping into the light. The order fell into obscurity decades ago, but the records remained. Sir Reginald must have found something. Something he wasn't meant to see. A heavy silence followed. Holmes sat back, his expression unreadable. And the bishop? Crowley hesitated. The bishop is a title within the order, a handler, an enforcer of sorts. If Sir Reginald was warning you about the bishop, then it means... A sudden crash interrupted him. The sound of shattering glass. Holmes was on his feet in an instant. "Watson, down!" A shot rang out, splintering the wooden door frame. I barely had time to react before Holmes yanked me aside, pressing us both against the wall as another bullet struck the bookshelf where Crowley had been standing. By the time I scrambled up, breathless and heart-pounding, the only thing left of our attacker was a silhouette disappearing into the fog. Holmes straightened, brushing dust from his coat. His expression was eerily calm. "It appears, Watson," he murmured, "that we are now playing the game in earnest." I swallowed hard. The pieces were moving, and we were running out of time. Chapter 6. The gunshot echoed in my ears long after the room had fallen silent. A moment before, Elias Crowley had been standing in front of us, speaking of the Order of the Black King. And now he lay crumpled on the floor, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Holmes crouched beside him at once, pressing a hand to his wound. "Watson!" he barked. "Quickly!" I dropped to my knees, my medical training taking over. The bullet had struck him high in the shoulder, missing his heart but tearing through muscle. His pulse was weak, but he was alive, for now. Crowley's lips trembled, his skin already slick with cold sweat. He tried to speak, but only a rasp came forth. Holmes leaned in, his ear close to the dying man's mouth. A single whisper, a final breath, then silence. I pulled back, checking for any sign of life. I met Holmes's gaze grimly. "He's gone." Holmes remained still for a long moment. Then, slowly, he stood. His face was unreadable, but his hands clenched into tight, fists at his sides. "He was our last witness," he murmured, "and now he is a pawn removed from the board." Lestrade arrived minutes later, summoned by the commotion. He stepped over the threshold, taking in the scene with a grimace. "Another body," he muttered. "And I suppose you'll tell me this one is part of your grand conspiracy as well." Holmes did not answer immediately. He turned toward the shattered window, peering into the fog. "This was not an impulsive killing," he said at last. "It was an execution." Lestrade scoffed. "A hired assassin, then?" Holmes turned to face him. "Not just any assassin, Lestrade. The bishop." The room fell silent. Lestrade shook his head. "You're still chasing ghosts, Holmes. You've been talking about this Order of the Black King as if it were some sort of shadow government." Holmes fixed him with a cold stare. "Then tell me, Inspector, how do you explain the fact that everyone who knew about it is now dead?" Lestrade hesitated. Holmes took a step closer, lowering his voice. "This is not a theory. It is a game, carefully orchestrated, and unless we determine the identity of the bishop, we will never reach the Black King before he moves again." We returned to Baker Street just before dawn, exhaustion settling upon me like a heavy shroud. Holmes, however, remained restless. He stood before the fireplace, his gaze fixed on the flames as though seeking answers within them. I sank into my chair with a weary sigh. Holmes, what did Crowley say to you before he died? Holmes did not look at me. 3 words, Watson. He turned, his sharp eyes meeting mine. The White Queen, I frowned. The White Queen? Another chess piece. Holmes nodded slowly. It would appear so. But unlike the bishop or the king, this is a defensive piece. The protector. I rubbed my temples. Then Crowley was trying to tell us that someone, perhaps a woman, is still alive? That she knows the truth? Holmes's expression darkened. If she is still alive, Watson, she is in grave danger. A chill ran through me. And if she is already dead? Holmes did not answer, but the flickering light of the fire cast strange shadows across his face, and I knew that even he did not have the answer to that question yet. Later that morning, as we prepared to leave for Scotland Yard to examine Crowley's belongings, a sharp knock came at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered with a note, her expression puzzled. A young boy delivered this, she said. Didn't say a word, just handed it to me and ran off. Holmes took the note without a word, unfolding it carefully. I watched as his eyes scanned the page, his jaw tightening. What is it? I asked. He handed me the slip of paper. The message was short, written in a delicate but hurried hand. I know the truth. But they are watching me. Meet me at the Whispering Garden at midnight. Come alone. It was unsigned. Lestrade, who had arrived moments before, leaned over my shoulder and frowned. Whispering Garden. That's the old courtyard behind St. Bartholomew's Hospital. Holmes nodded absently, already deep in thought. Then we must assume the meeting is genuine, Lestrade scoffed, or that it's a trap. Holmes smirked faintly. Naturally, I exhaled. And yet you intend to go? Holmes retrieved his coat and hat. Watson, when one is invited to a game, it would be most impolite to decline. That night we arrived at the Whispering Garden. It was a secluded courtyard, long overgrown with ivy and stone archways that whispered when the wind passed through them. The place was eerily silent, the faint glow of gas lamps barely penetrating the darkness. Holmes moved ahead with his usual quiet confidence, scanning the surroundings with practiced ease. Lestrade and I followed, though the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Then from the shadows a figure emerged, a woman. She was cloaked in a dark veil, her hands trembling as she stepped toward us. Holmes lifted a hand, motioning for us to remain still. She stopped a few feet away. Her voice, when she spoke, was barely above a whisper. "You are Sherlock Holmes?" Holmes inclined his head. "I am." The woman hesitated. Then, with a glance, over her shoulder she removed her veil. Lestrade sucked in a sharp breath. I felt my own stomach tighten. It was Lady Eleanor Havisham, the widow of Sir Reginald Havisham. She was supposed to be dead. I could not hide my shock. But, Lady Eleanor, your carriage was found overturned near the Thames. You were presumed drowned. Her dark eyes met mine, filled with haunted determination. They wanted you to believe that. Holmes studied her carefully. Then tell us, Lady Eleanor, why are you here? Her voice trembled, but she did not falter. Because, Mr. Holmes, my husband was not the true target. I was. Silence. Then Holmes spoke, his voice laced with something I rarely heard from him. Genuine unease. Watson, he murmured, we have been playing this game from the wrong side of the board. Lady Eleanor swallowed. You don't understand. Sir Reginald was part of something far greater than you know. He tried to leave them. That is why they killed him. Lestrade stiffened. Them? She turned, scanning the shadows, before whispering the words that sent a chill through my bones. The Order of the Black King, Holmes exhaled. Then we have much to discuss. The night stretched on, the game shifting once more. But as Holmes listened to her story, I could not shake the feeling that we had stepped beyond mere murder. We were now entangled in something far greater, and I feared we would not all live to see the final move. Chapter 7. Lady Eleanor Havisham stood before us, her face pale but resolute. The weight of her words hung in the night air, sinking deep into the marrow of my bones. The Order of the Black King, Holmes, ever the master of composure, regarded her with calculating eyes. Start from the beginning, Lady Eleanor. Tell us everything. She took a breath, gathering herself. Sir Reginald was not merely a victim, Mr. Holmes. He was a man who once belonged, a knight on the board of a secret society. He sought to leave, but there are some games where the only escape is death. Lestrade scoffed. Secret societies. Sounds like nonsense to me. Holmes turned to him, his gaze sharp. Then explain why everyone involved is dead, Lestrade. The inspector fell silent. Lady Eleanor continued. They have ruled from the shadows for decades, ensuring that those in power, judges, politicians, bankers, all play their role. Sir Reginald wished to leave their ranks, to sever ties, but in doing so he became a liability. He found something he was not meant to see. Holmes steepled his fingers. The documents at St. Augustine's. She nodded. Yes, he discovered records detailing an upcoming meeting, one that would decide the next generation of leadership. Within the Order, he was going to expose them. But before he could act, he was silenced. I exhaled, the full gravity of the situation dawning upon me. Then his murder was not just retribution. It was prevention. Holmes nodded. A preemptive strike. He was not just killed. He was removed from the board before he could make his move. Lady Eleanor's voice dropped to a whisper. And I was next. A heavy silence settled between us. Holmes turned, staring into the fog-laden darkness of the whispering garden. You were presumed dead, he mused. A convenient tragedy, no doubt arranged by the Order itself. But why spare you? Lady Eleanor swallowed. I was meant to disappear. The accident was staged, but I escaped before they could finish the job. I have been in hiding ever since. Lestrade ran a hand over his face. So, we're not just dealing with a murderer. We're dealing with a whole damned conspiracy. Holmes smiled faintly. Precisely, Lestrade. And that, I'm afraid, is where it gets rather interesting. Lestrade scoffed. Interesting isn't the word I'd use, Holmes. I, however, saw the glint in my friend's eyes. He was ahead of us, already working through the puzzle. Lady Eleanor, Holmes said, when you fled, did you take anything with you? She hesitated. Only one thing, a ledger. Holmes's eyes gleamed. And where is it? She reached into her cloak and retrieved a small, leather-bound book. Holmes took it with the reverence of a priest handling a sacred text. He flipped through the pages, his fingers pausing every so often. Then, abruptly, he stopped. "Ah!" I leaned in. "What is it, Holmes?" He turned the book toward me. There, scrawled, in ink, was a list of names, among them Inspector Lestrade. The blood drained from my face. I turned to Lestrade, who stood frozen, his face pale. Holmes's voice was smooth, almost amused. "It appears, Lestrade, that you have been playing this game far longer than we realized." Lestrade stepped back. "Holmes, I don't know how my name got there, I swear it." Holmes regarded him coolly. "Perhaps, but it seems our bishop has been closer than we thought." A sudden chill filled the air. My fingers twitched toward my revolver, though I did not yet draw it. Lestrade's jaw tightened. "You think I'm part of this?" Holmes tapped the ledger. "Your name is here, listed alongside known members. Tell me, Lestrade, can you explain that?" Lestrade opened his mouth, then closed it. Holmes's voice lowered to a whisper. "The question, Lestrade, is not whether you are involved. It is whether you know you are involved." The inspector swallowed hard. "Holmes, if this is a trap, I swear—" Holmes waved a hand. "No need for theatrics, Lestrade. I do not believe you are our man, but someone very much wanted us to." Lady Eleanor's voice was barely above a whisper. "Then, the bishop?" Holmes closed the book with a snap. "Still hidden, but not for long." He turned to me, his expression unreadable. "Watson, I do believe it's time we made the next move." I frowned. "And what would that be?" Holmes smirked. "We let the Black King think he has already won." The game was reaching its final stages. The board was set, the pieces in motion, and the final move was coming. Chapter 8 Holmes stood before us, ledger in hand, his sharp gaze moving between Lady Eleanor and Lestrade. The weight of the revelation settled heavily in the whispering garden, the silence thick with unspoken suspicions. "Holmes," I said cautiously, "if Lestrade is not the bishop, then why is his name in the ledger?" Holmes exhaled through his nose, his fingers drumming lightly on the worn leather of the book. "Because, Watson, a name on a list is not proof of guilt. It is proof of association." Lestrade straightened, his fists clenching. "You're damn right it isn't. I've never had any dealings with this Order of the Black King, never even heard of them before this case." Holmes studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "I believe you. But that does not mean you have not been used, Inspector." Lady Eleanor took a step forward, her voice soft but insistent. "Then we are still no closer to finding the bishop. And if we do not find him, we will never reach the Black King." Holmes smiled faintly. "On the contrary, my dear Lady Eleanor, we are closer than ever." He turned to Lestrade. "Tell me, Inspector, who within Scotland Yard would have access to such a ledger? Who could insert a name without your knowledge?" Lestrade's brow furrowed. "Someone high up, a commissioner perhaps, or a senior officer." His voice trailed off as realization dawned. Holmes's smile widened. "Precisely. I felt the energy in the air shift, as though a storm were about to break. Holmes, you know who the bishop is, don't you?" Holmes turned to me, his expression unreadable. "I suspected before. Now I am certain." Lestrade stiffened. "Who is it?" Holmes sighed, tucking the ledger into his coat. "All in good time, Lestrade. But first we must lay a trap, and for that we shall require bait." I frowned. "Bait?" Holmes's gaze flickered to Lady Eleanor. Her eyes widened. "You mean me?" Holmes inclined his head. "You are the only surviving loose end, Lady Eleanor. The last witness to Sir Reginald's involvement with the Order. The Bishop will try to eliminate you before you can speak further." She swallowed hard, but her voice was steady. "And you intend to let him come to me?" Holmes's expression was calm, but there was a glint of steel in his eyes. "Yes, but not before we make him believe he has already won." 2 nights later, we set the stage. Lady Eleanor, against her better judgment, agreed to return to Havisham Manor. The house had remained sealed since Sir Reginald's death, the study untouched. It was the perfect place for the final confrontation. Holmes, Lestrade, and I concealed ourselves within the manor, watching from the shadows. The house was dark, save for the single lamp burning in the study, casting flickering light across Lady Eleanor's figure as she sat at the desk. Holmes had given her clear instructions. She was to act as though she had discovered something important, something damning. She was to write in the ledger, pause, then glance nervously toward the door. She was to look as though she was on the verge of sending a letter, of making the knowledge public, and then we were to wait. The air was thick with tension. The minutes stretched into an hour, then another. My nerves were fraying, every creak of the old house setting my teeth on edge. Holmes, however, remained still, his sharp gaze never leaving the doorway. He was waiting for something. Then, at precisely 1 hour past midnight, we heard it, a soft click. The study door, locked since Lady Eleanor entered, was opening from the outside. Holmes tensed. I gripped my revolver. The door swung open, slow and silent. A figure emerged, their movements careful, deliberate. Not a common thief. Not a desperate killer. A man of precision. A man who had done this before. The Bishop. Holmes did not move, did not make a sound. He allowed the intruder to step fully into the room, to cross toward the desk where Lady Eleanor sat, feigning ignorance. Then, in a single swift movement, Holmes struck a match and held it aloft. The flame flared to life, illuminating the face of the intruder. I gasped. Lestrade cursed. Standing in the doorway, dressed in the formal uniform of Scotland Yard, was Superintendent Gregory Maddox. The Bishop! Lady Eleanor gasped and recoiled. Maddox, caught in the sudden burst of light, froze, but only for a fraction of a second. Then, with a soldier's reflexes, he drew a knife. Holmes moved first. In a blur of motion, he seized a heavy book from the desk and threw it with stunning accuracy. It struck Maddox's wrist, sending the knife clattering to the floor. Lestrade lunged, but the superintendent was quick. He turned, shoving past Lady Eleanor and making for the hallway. Holmes was faster. With almost inhuman speed, he vaulted over the desk and caught Maddox by the arm, wrenching him backward. The two men struggled, knocking over a chair. But Holmes had the advantage of leverage. In moments, he had Maddox pinned, his knee pressed against the man's back. Going somewhere, Superintendent? Holmes murmured. Lestrade recovered, moving, to cuff Maddox as the man sneered up at Holmes. "You think this changes anything?" he spat. "You have no idea how deep this goes." Holmes smirked. "Then perhaps you'd care to enlighten me." Maddox's lip curled, but he said nothing. Lestrade yanked him upright. "You're finished, Maddox. The whole of Scotland Yard will know about this by dawn." Maddox only smiled. "You think this ends with me?" Holmes leaned in slightly. "No, Superintendent, it ends with the Black King." A flicker of something, fear, crossed Maddox's face. Holmes saw it, and then, for the first time, I saw Sherlock Holmes hesitate. It was only for a second, a breath, but I knew him too well. Lestrade noticed nothing, but I did. Holmes was no longer certain who the Black King truly was, and that, more than anything, sent a chill down my spine. Maddox was taken into custody, but Holmes did not rest. For 3 nights he barely slept, reviewing the case, scouring documents, making connections that no ordinary man could see. Finally, on the 4th evening, as the firelight flickered against the walls of 221B Baker Street, he turned to me. "Watson," he murmured, "we were wrong." I blinked. "Wrong? About what?" He set down the ledger. His eyes met mine, filled with something rare. "Doubt. The Black King," he said softly. "We still do not know his name." The hairs on my arms rose. "But we have Maddox." Holmes shook his head. "Maddox was the bishop, the executioner. But he was never the true mastermind." I swallowed hard. "Then who?" Holmes turned toward the fire. The flames cast shifting shadows against the walls. He did not answer me at first. Then, finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "The game is not over, Watson. It has only just begun." Chapter 9. The days following Superintendent Maddox's arrest were restless ones. Holmes barely slept, pacing Baker Street like a caged predator, his mind locked in a battle I could not yet perceive. The case, it seemed, was not as finished as we had hoped. Maddox, the Bishop of the Order of the Black King, had refused to speak further. Scotland Yard had him in custody, but no amount of questioning had pried the truth from him. Holmes had been present for every interrogation, watching with unwavering scrutiny, and yet Maddox remained silent. "Watson," Holmes said suddenly one evening, as I sat in my armchair flipping absently through a newspaper, "Maddox is not afraid of prison." I glanced up. "No." Holmes's fingers steepled beneath his chin. "No, because he believes he will not stay there for long." A chill settled over me. "You think they will attempt to free him?" Holmes shook his head. "No, he is too exposed now. The Order will remove him. The Black King does not tolerate failure." I exhaled sharply. "Then we must protect him." Holmes's smile was grim. "He is already being watched. The question, Watson, is who will strike first, Scotland Yard or the Order?" The answer came the very next morning. Lestrade burst into 221B, his face pale with fury. "Holmes, Maddox is dead!" Holmes' eyes flickered, but he did not look surprised. "Elaborate?" Lestrade threw his coat aside. "Found in his cell at dawn. No signs of forced entry. No marks on the body. The doctor claims heart failure." He exhaled angrily. "But I don't believe it for a second." Holmes rose smoothly to his feet. "Of course not. The order has silenced him." Lestrade's lips pressed into a thin line. "We had him under constant watch, Holmes. No one entered that cell." Holmes picked up his coat and hat. "Then the method was not external. It was delayed." I stiffened. "Poison?" Holmes nodded. "A slow-acting agent. Something carefully measured so that he would die at the precise moment necessary. Likely ingested before he was even arrested." Lestrade cursed. "Then we've lost our best lead." Holmes turned to him, his gaze sharp. "No, Lestrade. We have just been given confirmation." Lestrade frowned. "Confirmation of what?" Holmes's voice was quiet, but filled with certainty. "That the Black King is still watching us." We've arrived at Scotland Yard, the atmosphere thick with unease. Maddox's cell was untouched, his body lying stiff upon the narrow cot. I moved closer, examining him carefully. There were no signs of a struggle, no trauma, no indication of foul play. And yet he was undoubtedly murdered. Holmes stood beside me, his sharp gaze sweeping every inch of the cell. Then, quite suddenly, he crouched down, his fingers ghosting, over the floor beneath the cot. I leaned in. "What is it?" Holmes did not answer immediately. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small magnifying glass, inspecting something that only he had noticed. Then, softly, he murmured, "Fascinating." Lestrade, standing behind us, sighed impatiently. "Holmes, if you found something—" Holmes stood, his expression unreadable. "Not something, Lestrade. Someone." He handed me a small, nearly imperceptible slip of paper. On it, scrawled in the faintest ink, were the words, "The White Queen falls next." I felt my breath catch. "Lady Eleanor?" Holmes nodded grimly. "The Order does not intend to leave loose ends." Lestrade cursed under his breath. "Then we need to find her. Now." Holmes was already moving. "Indeed. And if my deductions are correct, we may already be too late." Havisham Manor loomed in the evening mist as we approached. The house had remained sealed since our trap had lured out Maddox, but something in the air felt wrong. Holmes strode ahead, his movements quick but calculated. "Be on your guard, Watson." I tightened my grip on my revolver. "You expect an ambush?" Holmes's gaze flickered to the darkened windows. "I expect we are walking into the final move of this game." We stepped inside. The house was eerily silent. The dust in the entryway was undisturbed. No footprints, no sign of struggle. Lestrade frowned. "Are you certain she's here?" Holmes moved ahead without answering. He led us toward the study, the very room where Sir Reginald had met his end. The door was ajar. Holmes hesitated, then pushed it open, and there, seated at the desk, was Lady Eleanor. Or rather, what was left of her. She was slumped forward, her head resting upon a single sheet of paper. Her skin was pale, waxen, her fingers limp, her breathing non-existent. I stepped forward instinctively, checking for a pulse, but there was none. She was gone. Lestrade swore, running a hand through his hair. "Damn it, we were too late." Trent remained still. Then, ever so carefully, he reached for the paper beneath Lady Eleanor's hand. He lifted it, read it, and for the first time in our years together, I saw him truly go still. "Holmes!" I whispered. His fingers tightened on the page, then softly he spoke. "This is not a confession." Lestrade frowned. "Then what is it?" Holmes's voice was barely above a whisper. "A message." He turned the paper toward us. The writing was jagged, hurried, written in the last desperate moments of a dying woman. But the words were unmistakable. The Black King was never a man. It was the order itself. A heavy silence fell over us. Lestrade exhaled. "Then, there is no single man to arrest, no leader to cut down." Holmes nodded. "Precisely, Lestrade. The game was never about finding one man. It was about dismantling an empire." I swallowed hard. "And can it be dismantled?" Holmes did not answer immediately. He stared down at Lady Eleanor's lifeless form, at the final warning she had left us. Then, finally, he whispered, "The Black King has already won." We left Havisham Manor in silence. The night air was cold, pressing against my skin like an unseen weight. Holmes walked ahead of us, his shoulders tense. For the first time, I did not know what he was thinking. As we reached Baker Street, I found my voice. "Holmes," I said carefully, "is this the end?" Holmes hesitated. Then, slowly, he turned toward me. "There is no end, Watson." Your voice was quiet, but firm. "Only the next move," I exhaled. "Then what do we do?" Holmes met my gaze, and then, in the flickering glow of the street lamps, he smiled. "We wait. For what, I did not yet know. But I had a feeling that somewhere in the shadows of London, the next game had already begun. Chapter 10. The days that followed were cloaked in an eerie stillness, as if London itself had paused to watch what Sherlock Holmes would do next. The newspapers covered the death of Superintendent Maddox, and though Scotland Yard claimed responsibility for bringing a corrupt officer to justice, we knew the truth. The Black King was not one man, but an idea, an empire woven into the very fabric of power. Lady Eleanor Havisham had died trying to warn us. But was it too late? Holmes did not speak of the case at first. He withdrew into himself, pacing Baker Street in silence, his sharp gaze distant. His violin remained untouched, his meals left uneaten. I knew that something within him was unravelling the truth, but whether he had found an answer, I could not yet say. And then, one evening, he spoke. "Watson," he murmured, standing before the fireplace, "there is one final move to make." I set down my tea. "You have a plan?" His lips curved faintly. "A rather dangerous one." Lestrade, who had joined us that evening, frowned. "Dangerous how?" Holmes turned his gaze sharp. "We do not yet know the identity of the Order's true leaders, but what we do know is that they have spent years remaining unseen. Their greatest strength has been their ability to operate in the shadows, manipulating events without ever being directly exposed." Lestrade scoffed. "So, how do you expose men who refuse to be seen?" Holmes's smile did not reach his eyes. "You make them believe they already have been." I straightened. "Holmes, what are you planning?" He strode to his desk, withdrawing a stack of papers. "Lady Eleanor left us a gift before she died. This ledger, it contains a partial list of names, not just those in the Order, but those connected to them. Financiers, intermediaries, men who have unknowingly assisted in their operations. Lestrade crossed his arms. "And what good does that do us?" Holmes met his gaze. "We let them believe that we have uncovered everything, that the entire truth is about to be made public, and in doing so, we force the true masterminds into the open." Lestrade exhaled. "You mean a trap?" Holmes inclined his head. "Precisely." I swallowed. "And what if they do not take the bait?" Holmes smiled thinly. "Then we have already lost." Days later, the announcement appeared in the Times. "The truth behind the Black King. Sherlock Holmes to present evidence before Parliament. It was a lie, of course, but it was the kind of lie that men like the Order of the Black King could not ignore." We had arranged for Holmes to make a public address, detailing the corruption within the highest ranks of London's power. Scotland Yard had agreed to provide security. The city buzzed with anticipation. The chessboard had been set, and now we waited for the opposing side to make their move. The morning of the event was thick with tension. Holmes, Lestrade, and I arrived at Westminster under the watchful eyes of the press. Guards had been stationed along every corridor. Scotland Yard officers lined the perimeter. And yet, I could not shake the feeling that we had underestimated our opponent. Holmes, however, seemed untroubled. He moved with quiet confidence, his hands tucked into the pockets of his greatcoat, his expression unreadable. Lestrade muttered under his breath, "I don't like this, Holmes. Feels too easy." Holmes smiled faintly. "Which is why they will strike now." Lestrade stiffened. "You think they'll attempt to kill you?" Holmes tilted his head. "Not me, Lestrade. You." I barely had time to process his words before a single gunshot cracked through the air. I turned sharply. Too late. Lestrade staggered, his face contorted in shock, blood spreading across his sleeve. A warning shot. Then, from the shadows, a voice. "Holmes, you have made a grave mistake." The hall fell deathly silent. Holmes turned, his expression unreadable, as a figure stepped forward from the crowd. My breath caught. It was Sir Geoffrey Montague, one of the most esteemed members of Parliament, a man known for his influence over law and policy, and now, standing before us, the true Black King. Holmes did not look surprised. He merely inclined his head. "Sir Geoffrey, how very predictable." Montague smiled coldly. "Did you truly believe you could bring down an empire with a single newspaper announcement?" Holmes regarded him with mild amusement. "Not at all. I merely needed you to confirm your role." Montague's smile faltered. "What?" Holmes turned, gesturing towards the assembled officers. "You see, Sir Geoffrey, this entire event, this entire trap, was never about exposing you to the public. It was about ensuring that you revealed yourself to the right people." I followed his gaze, and my breath caught. Standing along the walls, hidden in plain sight, were men I had not noticed before. Judges, policemen, bankers, officials, men of power, men who had been watching Montague carefully, men who had once been part of the order themselves, and now they saw what they had feared for so long, that their leader, their Black King, had become too visible, too reckless. Holmes smirked. A kingdom built on secrecy cannot survive the light. And I believe, Sir Geoffrey, that your men are now considering whether it is time for a new ruler. Montague's eyes darted around the room. He saw it, the way his allies shifted, the way power, true power, began to slip through his fingers. He reached for his gun. Holmes moved first. With a swift motion, he kicked Montague's arm, sending the gun clattering across the floor. The Black King lunged, but Lestrade, despite his wound, was faster. In moments, Montague was pinned. His face twisted in rage. "You think this is over?" he spat. Holmes crouched beside him, his voice barely above a whisper. "No, Sir Geoffrey. This was merely the beginning." That evening, back at Baker Street, Holmes sat by the fire, his expression unreadable. I watched him carefully. "You did it, Holmes. The order is finished." Holmes did not look up. "Is it?" I frowned. "Montague was the Black King. He fell today. It's over." Holmes exhaled slowly. Men like Montague are replaceable. The order existed before him. It will exist after him. I stiffened. "Then we've accomplished nothing?" Holmes finally turned, his sharp eyes meeting mine. "Not nothing, Watson." His voice was quiet. "We made them stumble. We forced them to play their hand. That alone is worth something." Exhaled. "And what now?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Now we wait." "For what?" He turned back toward the fire. The flames cast strange shadows across his face. "The next game," he murmured, "because there is always another game." The fire crackled, filling the silence, and I realized then that Sherlock Holmes would never stop. Not until the board was empty, not until the last piece had fallen, and perhaps not even then. End of The Secret Scotland Yard Hid